Islamic extremism is one of the largest national security concerns for most countries around the world. But do you know why it exists in the first place and how it has come to be such a big threat to peace around the world? Well, today I will tell you how it all started, who was involved, and how it came to be what it is now. The first traces of modern Islamic extremism can be found back when Iran turned into an Islamic theocracy, and the people protested in the streets and overthrew the Shah. The people had had enough of the Shah, exploiting Iran's oil and giving it to Western corporations. He implemented huge modernizing reforms and isolated the religious community from any participation in government. Ruling the country in a fashion of secular dictatorship, he used to suppress all political opposition violently. In 1978, protests began in Iran, taking over city by city. The pent-up anger of the people of Iran was too much. Even though the United States insisted upon not taking military action on any civilians, the Shah ignored them and started violently dispersing the protest. But they overwhelmed Iran's troops, and before long they had reached Tehran. The Shah then left on a vacation, never to come back. The exiled religious leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to the country with huge support. He started implementing his interpretation of Sharia law, which drastically changed the political and social boundaries of Iran, making it a much more conservative nation. This revolution was called the Iranian Islamic Revolution because it made a theocratic Islamic government come into power, flipping its own political spectrum as well as the world's. In 1979, the government of Afghanistan got overthrown in a coup, which resulted in a Soviet-friendly government taking power. In exchange of huge militaristic and financial benefits, the new Afghan government started implementing Soviet-oriented policies and reforms. This, of course, angered the religious public of Afghanistan. Riots started throughout the country and started taking a turn towards armed rebellions. One of the first armed rebellions was the siege of Herat, which lasted for a week, where rebel forces took over the city before the army was finally able to breach the rebels' defense and take back the city. The armed rebellion grew after this day by day, especially when Pakistan started supporting them openly. America took notice of this and saw this as an opportunity to make the Soviets pay for the Vietnam War. So they ignored Pakistan's nuclear program and the fact that Pakistan was being ruled by an Islamist dictator at the time, Ziaul Haq, and decided to give huge shipments of financial and military aid to Pakistan, meant for the Afghan Mujahideen. Pakistan's ISI started a program to fund these rebels by setting up training camps along the border, supplying the rebels with training, weapons, and financial aid to take over one city after another. This prompted the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which happened to turn out to be a big mistake. As soon as the Soviets deployed a division of their soldiers, they were facing high casualties due to the guerrilla attacks from the rebels. In 1982, the fighting had come to a stalemate, the Soviets ruling the urban areas while the rebels roaming freely through the rural areas. This was due to the funding the rebels were receiving from America and its allies. Pakistan was known to fund some of the most extremist commanders of the rebels, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who allegedly used the aid to bomb civilians and other rebels, and had also had close ties with Osama bin Laden. Soviets started a huge aerial bombing of the villages in order to eliminate any support for the rebels. America, rethinking its strategy, decided to supply the rebels with American-made Stinger missiles for the first time. This was the turning point of the war. The rebels were able to quickly shoot down Soviet aircraft and overwhelm them with casualties. In 1989, the Soviets had given up and decided to leave Afghanistan. The Afghan government was fought against for 3 years before they finally fell due to stoppage of aid from the Soviets. After the Iranian Revolution, its regime had grown hostile to most of the other secular Western-friendly regimes in the Middle East, particularly Iraq. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's Sunni dictator, was motivated to invade Iran by one of two reasons. The first one being that attacking Iran would disperse the likeliness of a Shia uprising supported by Iran in southern Iraq, as well as his desire to be the dominant Persian Gulf state. Hoping to take advantage of the chaos in Iran due to its revolution, it attacked informally without any warning. It had made limited progress when Iran retaliated, and by 1982 it had taken all its land back. For the rest of the war, Iran remained on the offensive, taking over small parts of Iraqi territory. Ba'athist and Kurdish militias as well as Shia Mujahideen also fought in the conflict. The Western nations, despite having the knowledge of Iraq using chemical weapons on civilians as well as on Iranian troops, greatly aided the Iraqis financially and militarily, as well as diplomatically on the global stage. America wanted Iran to lose this war, even if it required the use of chemical weapons. Afghanistan after the Soviets left was still in a state of war. Even though they had left, the Soviet-backed government still ruled Kabul. Not realizing that it was receiving huge aid and petroleum fuel from the Soviets, Pakistan and the Mujahideen forces planned their first major attack on the city using conventional warfare. Due to the deal with Pakistan, only they were allowed to administer American aid to the rebels. They provided huge amounts of aid to two of the more Islamist commanders, Hekmatyar and Rasul Sayyaf. The ISI and Hekmatyar's army planned an attack on the important city of Jalalabad. The rebels at first were advancing quickly without any retaliation or defense. When they started torturing the surrendered government soldiers, the ones who were fighting saw no choice but to fight harder. Apart from that, they were properly defended by barbed wire fences, aerial support, and bunkers. The rebels were then bombarded with Scud missiles and cluster bombs, which had no defense against. In 1989, the government took back the city. Both the US and Pakistan were frustrated with the outcome, as well as the involved rebel groups. This boosted the morale of the government troops, who had shown that they could fight without the Soviets. Many commanders from the rebel side defected to the government, as well as Hekmatyar's army started attacking other rebel groups, specifically Massoud's, who were still collecting victories in the north. In 1992, the aid of the Soviets was declining, until it was barely, if any, noticed. Afghanistan was running out of fuel and supplies quickly. By the spring of 1992, many of the most important commanders of the government had defected, as well as there was growing fighting between different factions of the government itself. The power was transferred to a new interim government, made just before the Peshawar Accords to administer the transition of power. The Peshawar Accords made an agreement to share power with different commanders who would take up different positions in the government. However, Hekmatyar, urged by Pakistan, ignored this and entered Kabul. Trying to protect Afghanistan from a Hekmatyar dictatorship, Massoud and Jamaat-e-Islami and its factions entered Kabul, driving out Hekmatyar's forces, who were far away from key buildings in the capital. The power was transferred to Jamaat and Massoud's forces, who then recovered huge weapon stockpiles to drive out Hekmatyar. On April 30, 1992, Kabul had come under full Islamic control. But the war was not over. Hekmatyar's forces were still outside the city within artillery range, ruthlessly bombing civilians and armed forces. Due to this failure, Pakistan was now losing faith in Hekmatyar's forces. In 1994, when the Taliban, who originated from the Islamic schools Pakistan had created for Afghan refugees, took over the southern provinces, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia's support shifted towards them. They were heavily supported and took one city after another, eventually reaching Kabul in 1995, when they attacked but failed to take the capital. In 1996, when the Taliban were preparing for a large-scale attack on Kabul, Ahmad Shah Massoud and the government forces withdrew before the Taliban seized power. The new government was not recognized by the international community and the UN. Ahmad Shah Massoud then formed the Northern Alliance with a few other militias to take back Kabul, only to fail repeatedly until the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. In 1990, when Iraq illegally invaded Kuwait, the Western powers turned against them, condemning them from the UN Security Council as well as privately by themselves. The fear of the invasion spreading to Saudi Arabia, President George Bush immediately ordered a defensive mission, codenamed Operation Desert Shield. It proceeded with 5 weeks of aerial and naval bombardment, followed by manned intervention. Some of the common justifications given by the US for this operation were to protect the territorial integrity of Kuwait as well as other Gulf states, and to stop Iraq from using its WMDs. So why was America so worried now but not a decade before when Iraq invaded Iran? America had backed Iraq when it used WMDs against Iran and violated its territorial integrity. Iran was not an ally, but Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were. They feared if Iraq invaded Saudi Arabia, their oil monopoly would collapse with the country. So they gave these justifications sound politically correct and to protect their oil butt buddies from attack, once again manipulating foreign affairs for their interests. And in 2001, one day changed the entire course of foreign policy for nations around the world. That day was September 11, 2001. Before the actual attacks, although, President Bush and President Clinton had gotten intelligence suggesting that an attack was going to take place in the near future. In 1998, the CIA reported to Bill Clinton that Al-Qaeda was preparing for a large-scale attack on the US, which included hijacking aircraft. Ahmad Shah Massoud also warned the US of the attack from Al-Qaeda in Brussels when he spoke to the UN. In the year of 2001, President Bush got a total of 5 warnings, all of which he obviously ignored. On May 1st, the CIA reported that there was a group in the US planning an attack. In June 29th, the CIA warned the president's administration again, saying the attacks were going to happen in the near future and will have dramatic consequences. On September 11th, 2001, 2 planes struck the twin World Trade Towers, exploding and collapsing both buildings. One crashed into the Pentagon, the last one crashing in a remote farm of Pennsylvania, after passengers had overpowered the hijackers. This event had shook the world, specifically on how easily these amateur terrorists had managed to kill 3,000 Americans on US soil.
The September 11th attacks, there were huge speculations as to who was behind these attacks, who was the mastermind. Now, one answer is obvious: it was Al-Qaeda. That is because due to the huge warnings President Bush and his administration got before these September 11th attacks, and they were the only enemy that would carry out a guerrilla attack against the United States. So, after the September 11th attacks, the US government asked the Taliban that were governing Afghanistan at the time to give up Osama bin Laden, since he had taken part in the September 11th attacks. The Taliban asked the US for convincing evidence that he was involved in the 9/11 attacks. The US saw this as a delaying tactic, and on 7th October 2001 it launched Operation Enduring Freedom to take the Taliban out of power and to destroy all safe havens of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Once it had invaded Afghanistan, it quickly took the Taliban out of power, before 2003 when the NATO forces also joined the US in the war. After the Taliban had come out of power, Hamid Karzai was selected to be the head of the Afghan interim administration. In the elections of 2004, Karzai was elected president of the country, now named the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks were the pretext of the war on terror that President Bush started. The war on terror resulted in the Iraq invasion of 2003. America's main justification for going into Iraq was that Saddam Hussein was building nuclear weapons and was harboring Al-Qaeda terrorists that had carried out the 9/11 attacks. Although these accusations were proved wrong, they were even absurd to think of in the first place. Even if Iraq did possess the WMDs, which it didn't, the implication that it would use it on the US was just plain stupid. Saddam Hussein was a secular dictator who had enough rational sense that if he used any WMDs on the US, his country would be blown off the map in 2 seconds. Since Saddam Hussein was secular, Islamic extremists were the #1 enemies of his regime. There would be zero chance that he would ever harbor or help them in any way. When the US did go into Iraq, it captured Baghdad within a month and started a bigger nation-building effort. One of the biggest mistakes was that de-Baathification of the government. This left thousands of men, mainly Sunnis, out of jobs, which led the hatred towards the US. Dismantling the army was also a great mistake. Letting 120,000 armed and trained military men into the public, specifically if they were the force that you're fighting, isn't a very good idea.
After the toppling of the regime, the US Army noticed a huge increase in guerrilla attacks throughout the country, especially in the Sunni areas of Iraq. These were carried out by either Sunni insurgents or radical fighters of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, fight against the US. The Iraqi army had just melted when the US had invaded Iraq, after which many of the generals and soldiers had formed an insurgency due to the power vacuum. The Shia people, also fed up of the coalition not fulfilling its promises of providing jobs and restoring Iraq's infrastructure, joined the insurgency against the coalition. The guerrilla attacks and city sieges went on for about a year, until elections were held, which had huge Kurdish and Shia turnout but barely any Sunni contribution. The minor involvement of Sunnis in the government started sparking sectarian tensions. After the elections, the Shia militias had settled down, but the Sunni insurgents started getting more aggressive against the coalition forces, and Sunni areas before the insurgency deteriorated into a civil war. The civil war was sparked by an attack on an important Shia shrine, Al-Askari Mosque, where countless people were killed and injured. In the following period, many of the moderate Sunni insurgents were forced to join the radical fighters and fight for the Sunnis. In 2006, Iraq was experiencing full-out civil war. Suicide attacks, car bombs, and rocket attacks were rampant in Shia areas, carried out by Sunni radical fighters of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Both the Shia militias and Sunni radical groups engaged in waves of fighting, which were abundant with civilian and military killings. On June 2006, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq was killed, easing out the attack from the Sunni fighters. In 2007, the US decided to make a surge to wipe out the Sunni radical fighters and ensure security. The surge was temporarily effective in decreasing the violence throughout the country. In 2008, many of the sovereignties of cities and provinces were given back to the Shia-led government, angering the Sunnis. 2008 through 2010 remained peaceful with minimal fighting. However, sectarian tensions were very well increasing. After the withdrawal of American troops in 2011, Sunni radical insurgency began again. The Arab Spring was an important time in the history of Arab countries. Many oppressive regimes were toppled in North Africa, bringing a new surge of political tensions and anarchy. The oppressive regimes of Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Tunisia were also toppled, making these countries very unstable. Although many regimes had fallen, there was one exception: Syria. The protests in Syria that were happening at the time of the Arab Spring turned out to a different outcome: a civil war. When people started protesting, Bashar al-Assad used force on them to disperse the protests. This slowly grew into an armed rebellion over time. As the conflict escalated, the people and the regime forces clearly became forming sides. The rebels were now constantly attacking cities and government buildings in an effort to overthrow the Assad regime. By late 2011, a full civil war had erupted, and different groups like moderate Syrian rebels, Kurdish fighters, and extremists were fighting for their own interests. Many of the insurgents were fighting a sectarian war against Assad, who was Shia. Others just wanted to overthrow the Assad government and bring a democratic one. The extremists wanted to take territory and establish their own laws. As fighting escalated even more, foreign intervention became prominent. The US was training and arming the FSA, the dominant moderate group. However, Iran and Russia were supporting the government loyalist forces. Even though the US was supporting the FSA, Islamic State, the most brutal extremist group present, started becoming a more dominant force. When it was clear that they had no chance, the FSA would often surrender or defect to Islamic State, bringing American weapons and training to them. Inferring from this, it can be easily said that America's actions were indirectly assisting ISIS in gaining more ground in Syria. The Syrian regime was ISIS's number one enemy in Syria. By eliminating them, America was making it easier for them to come into power. American allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, were also not stopping at anything to establish their own regional hegemony, with private donors funding many extremist Sunni militias to overthrow the Shia government of Syria. Although the Syrian regime was no good guy, removing them would increase the threat of Islamic State taking over the capital, as they're the most dominant rebel force with the interests of overthrowing the regime. Would people trade the atrocities of Assad with the much more gruesome and barbaric practices of ISIS? Iraq, after the withdrawal of US troops in 2011, was turning into a hellhole. The Shia-dominated government was rampant with corruption and Sunni oppression, angering the Sunni public and giving Al-Qaeda in Iraq a second chance. In 2012, Al-Qaeda in Iraq started a series of attacks that would envelop Iraq for the next 2 years. By 2012, the violence began to escalate to the point where it was the most violent year of the war since 2008. While al-Nusra Front was growing away from Islamic State, it had launched an operation to take the Sunni Anbar province in December 2012. When they did start attacking Iraqi cities one by one, the Iraqi army started surrendering before the fight even came to them. ISIS started taking one city after another, causing chaos in the ranks of the army when it took Ramadi and Fallujah. The Iraqi army was mainly made of Shias and had no interest in defending the Sunni areas of Iraq. Once ISIS captured the first city, they started pushing the rhetoric of Sunni oppression by the Shias in the West. This drove the number of recruits to the roof, with thousands of men pouring from around the world as well as Iraq to join the self-proclaimed jihadist army. They were not shy at all to show their brutality by beheading people, taking sex slaves and oppressing women, and videotaping all this. Capturing one city after another and spreading their rhetoric like a virus, they at last reached the second most important city in Iraq, Mosul. As 800 ISIS fighters approached the city, 2 divisions of the Iraqi army numbering up to 30,000 soldiers dropped their weapons and ran for their lives. By the end of this, ISIS was roaming the streets, celebrating how easily they had taken over the city. This was a disastrous moment. 500,000 people fled from the city. Then thousands of Sunni militants joined ISIS, capturing Saddam Hussein's hometown Tikrit, as well as Iraq's biggest oil facility, making it the richest and most powerful group that had ever existed. In the next month, ISIS finally declared its caliphate, combining its territory in Syria and Iraq. With this, they had unleashed a new wave of brutality. Obama finally authorized airstrikes on ISIS, with other NATO countries coming in to help later. Combining US military advisors and airstrikes with trained Shiite militias fighting against IS, it started losing battles as well as support from other rebel groups in Syria. By the end of 2014, ISIS had started facing setbacks from Shiite militias. However, the airstrikes failed to do much against it. Syria was a different story in 2014 for ISIL. It had lost support from the Syrian wing and most of the other rebel groups as well as Al-Qaeda. This was a large setback for the group. Many of the rebel groups were able to recapture many towns and cities from ISIS control. At this point, a coalition of Arab and European countries were leading aerial bombing campaigns against ISIS. In 2015, ISIS had finally started losing its territory in Iraq, when the Iraqi army and other militias teamed up to fight the organization. So, who is to blame? Some people would like to keep it simple and just blame Islam for being too violent, or Muslims for being too radical, but it's much deeper than that. The real cause of the rise of extremism to the point where it presents a threat to the international community started from the Afghan-Soviet War. America, teaming up with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, funded the Afghan Mujahideen that were fighting for an Islamist cause. The same people who America funded in the Soviet-Afghan war later disintegrated into the Taliban. After the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror that President Bush declared on all terrorists would kill much more innocent people than it would ever save. Starting wars in countries that didn't attack them like Iraq was its first mistake. Or was it a mistake? It is well known that a huge part of the presidential elections are the lobbyists and corporations that pay the politicians to go to war so that their arms manufacturing and oil refining businesses could boom. And that is exactly what President Bush did in Iraq. It was just too obvious that Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack, or supporting any terrorist groups. What President Bush really wanted would be to set up a puppet government that would make room for all the oil corporations to exploit Iraq's oil. A person with 2 brain cells to rub together would realize that Iraq was divided along the line of sect, religion, and race, and many of the different groups were extremely hostile to each other. Having a dictator is not the best solution, but that's what kept their country together and stable. The complete de-Baathification of the government gave the army generals to form an insurgency out of the power vacuum. And guess what sprouted out from the chaos? Al-Qaeda, who didn't have a presence in Iraq before the invasion. After the invasion, the power vacuum and anarchy had given Al-Qaeda a perfect opportunity for a training ground. But what made these insurgent groups very popular? The fact that the US had almost killed 1 million innocent Iraqi civilians meant that they had enraged almost 1 million families. The families of these civilians were convinced by Al-Qaeda's propaganda and fought against the coalition fueled by their rage. That is how this turned into the opposite of what it was meant to be. Setting up a puppet government was probably a bigger mistake. Angering the 40% of the Sunni population is not a good idea. The oppression of the Sunnis then fueled more rage among Sunni people who then joined groups like Islamic State to fight against Westerners and Shia people. And leaving your weapons behind after a war in a hellhole like Iraq would just be a great idea. No, but it's exactly what the US did. IS greatly by indirectly supplying them with American weapons. Leaving a Shia government in power would mean the military would predominantly be Shia as well. The Shiites had no interest in defending the Sunni areas from ISIS. The billions of dollars wasted in training and equipping an army who ran for their lives when 800 fighters was just an embarrassment. Some elements in the US Congress were blaming Iran to be siding with ISIS, which even made the situation more absurd. Since Iran is Shiite and the number one enemy of ISIS, sending militias and special forces to defend Baghdad from them. In Syria, the US had always been against the Assad regime because Bashar al-Assad was depriving people of their human rights, but also because it wasn't a friendly regime to NATO countries. First, when the civil war started, the US called the fall of the Assad regime. Later in the conflict, when IS became a dominant rebel force, they then called off their support for all rebel groups and trained the moderate Syrian rebels. Conducting airstrikes, the US-led coalition was divided between bombing ISIS and the Assad regime, eventually helping what they were fighting. Their allies in the region like Saudi Arabia and Qatar had, although called ISIS a terrorist organization, were allegedly buying oil and supporting ISIS for their own interest of overthrowing the Shia governments of Iraq and Syria. The moderate rebels the US was training didn't last long against ISIS and soon started defecting, surrendering their weapons to ISIS. When Russia in 2015 invaded Syria, US and NATO condemned the intervention, calling for the stopping of support of Assad. So when countries legally invade another country to fight off a terrorist, it's wrong, but when one country illegally invades another country without any particular reason, no one bats an eye. If you won't side with Assad for a moment, then you'll be fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Is that what the US wants? Secretly, it might just be. They would rather have a fight going on than watching the Assad government take power and build a stable Syria, since it's friendly to Russia and Iran. See, America doesn't care about morality or the well-being of countries. All it cares about is fulfilling its interests and feeding its integrity to its corrupt capitalist economy. Hopefully the superpowers can leave their personal interest for once and come together to solve this problem, because that is the only way we can get rid of this problem.